This is Lance Hauge, and it's pronounced Hauge. Lance has over 30 years of experience in the industry. He was a therapist long before I was. In 1994, he graduated from Arizona State University with an undergraduate degree in exercise science. In 1995, he graduated from the Rolfe Institute in Boulder, Colorado. In 1996, he moved to Minneapolis and started a Rolfing practice here. Since then, he's added craniosacral work, chakra work, neuromuscular repatterning, internal martial arts, and many more things. In 2010, Lance graduated from the Adler Graduate School with a master's degree in psychology, and then he began mixing all that together. And we're extremely thrilled to have him at the clinic, be part of the clinic. And so we're lucky to have him here. In 2012, he founded a wellness clinic called the Dimension Center, and it's important to mention that is still running strong. Now, Lance specializes in trauma work, developmental issues, and mind-body issues. And we've been bugging him for a long time to show up and share some of his knowledge. And hopefully in the future, because he's got so much stuff, I think hopefully he'll share more in the future as well.
Thanks for the intro. I'm going to talk today about kind of the psychology field in general and the idea of psychological models. Give a little bit of kind of overview of how that has worked, a little bit of what my evolution's been in it, a little bit of a kind of my understanding of where the field is at today as far as the kind of theories and approaches to it, and then give a brief explanation of a thing I call the dimension approach, which is I always struggle to say what it is. It's an approach, it's a methodology, it's a something. And I always feel a little weird about putting a title on it. What happened was I studied all these various things, and then at a certain point I started to teach, and my students would say, well, what do you call? And I'd say, well, it's a little of this and a little of this and a little of that. And they would say, can you just like call it something? And so finally I called it the dimension approach, and I can explain why I gave it that name. But I don't claim to have invented anything. It was more that in my years of studying stuff, and I think everyone does this, you spend years and years studying something, and you finally get kind of a condensed systematic knowledge in your head, and then you say, well, how come they didn't just tell me it that way at the start? Because you feel like if someone had just presented it like that, you wouldn't have needed 20 years to figure it out. But I'm aware that that's not really how it works. We all go through learning curves and developments, and little by little stuff starts to make more sense to you. So what I did is I took certain concepts and kind of put them together into a certain thing that I apply to what I do, no matter what I'm working with, whether it's physical stuff, emotional stuff, mental stuff, and no matter what kind of issue it is. What I'm calling the dimension approach is something that I'm always trying to apply. And the way I tend to put it is everyone's either doing the dimension approach or not doing it moment to moment throughout every day. It's not some weird technique. It's something that is more of a universal human thing to either do or not do. So I'll come back to that. But just to start out with, the importance of having a coherent model of the psyche to be working on. It doesn't seem like there's much talk about that anymore. Back when Freud and Jung and those guys were doing their writing and their theorizing, a lot of the focus was on what is the human psyche, how does it work, and there was a lot of different theories about that, and a lot of debate, and basically there still is, meaning it's still largely unknown. The field of psychology doesn't have some kind of unified theory of mind or unified theory of the psyche. Different schools of thought have different ones. And then it seems that more and more in contemporary clinical settings and in the schools, there isn't even discussion about it. So you have therapists starting practices, and they don't really have an idea of what model are they working from. It's largely unconscious. And they haven't been presented with various models. And so clients come and pick a therapist, and the therapist just sort of comes from their own kind of personal of model of the psyche, their own worldview, their own cosmology, and you don't have much of a differential diagnosis happening as far as what's really going on with a client, what level or what area of the psyche is the problem, and the therapist isn't doing much. Am I able to treat this kind of thing, or should I refer to someone who's trained in the kind of modality that would apply to that? It's largely just absent from our field. It's just every therapist is out there doing their thing, and every client is on their own to hopefully luck into a therapist that is trained in doing the thing that they need. So I'm not sure what the fix is to that, except to do some educating oneself in what are the various models that are out there, and what ones apply to you. Obviously, it's some of it is, do you agree with it or not, right? Because it's none of this stuff is objective fact. It's all theories about how does the psyche work, and we all have different views on that. So different models reflect different ontological assumptions as far as what is real, what's not, different epistemological modes as far as how do we know what we know, and axiological values as far as what do we care about, right? What's the goal? What are we really working towards?
Lance, could you define axiological? I don't understand it.
Just as far as axioms that we so fundamental tenets, initial premises, first causes that we're sort of starting from.
Okay.
There's always this sense of trying to go back to, okay, well, what's that originating from?
Could you call it a core belief or?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, so without an underlying knowledge of a model, not only can we sometimes miss where the real problem is, but sometimes it can be damaging, right? We can re-traumatize. We can have a client really feel like they are unfixable or untreatable because we didn't get at what was going on. And so there's a lot of reasons to, I think, in the field, pay more attention to psychological models and differential diagnosis.
That's an extremely important point. If we more or less don't know how to treat them, they can walk away feeling like a broken unit. Or
right.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. The term psychotherapy has been used in a lot of different ways. My understanding is when it started with Freud, of course, is the big name that you hear, and it was called the talking cure and made fun of. And he was a regular doctor, but was proposing that a methodology that could perhaps be effective for working with a lot of maladies that just involved talking. And the general idea was psychotherapy would be needed when normal counseling, normal coaching, normal parenting, normal advising isn't working, right? Then is there something that can be done to address the issue, right? And so someone was a candidate for psychotherapy when kind of the normal learning or the normal obeying society's norms or normal functioning wasn't happening, and kind of the normal approaches were getting nowhere. Then the idea was there was this treatment modality that could kind of get underneath that, and that was a real revolution and breakthrough, right? And again, today we tend to not really, the depth psychodynamic psychoanalytic school of thought that's looking to get underneath just the normal thought process has kind of been left behind. A lot of it's originating now from cognition, from mentalizing, and certainly there is a top-down effect that goes on in the human psyche from thought to feeling to behavior. But when psychotherapy started, it was the exact opposite. It was that the unconscious was primary, The unconscious had its own structure, its own movement, and the ego, which they use that as that term's used a lot of different ways these days, but the ego was this place in the mind that basically is the receiver of unconscious content and energies, and the ego's tasked with trying to deal with that, organize that, interpret that. But again, that model has kind of been left behind, and I think it's unfortunate. I think it's unfortunate, at least, that people aren't even taught it anymore. Let alone do you agree with it, or do you integrate it into your into your thinking, into your clinical practice at all? A lot of the psychoanalytic schools tenets have been adopted and aren't even thought of as the psychoanalytic schools tenets anymore. They're just thought of as obvious truths, and then a lot of them have been left behind. So I'm just going to go through a few of the axioms of the psychoanalytic school that it seems like are not talked about much anymore. Unconscious motivation, which I just mentioned, that was the huge breakthrough, right? The discovery of the unconscious was something that kind of got it all started. And there was the idea that as it was put then, man is not master of his own home, that we live inside these body minds, and that energies, forces, thoughts arise in us, and not by our free will choosing. That we're, a lot of our experience and our thoughts and feelings are downstream from unconscious forces. And so there was a lot of study of what are these forces, how do they work, why are they there, and one of the big focuses was, what's the structure of the unconscious? Does it come up as just chaos? Does it come up as certain predetermined forms? And you had Carl Jung talked about archetypes, the idea what there are these general themes that humans have in them, and different people will kind of get identified with or wrapped up in certain archetypes. Other ones they'll reject. Freud's view in general was that there's all kinds of content there, just a huge mishmash of things, and that a lot of it, one of the huge ideas was, not only is there an unconscious, but the unconscious is in a state of psychosis, was the idea. Most of what we think of as horror, those themes are what's there in the unconscious, was the idea. And so our worst fears, our kind of what we consider to be our darkest motivations, that's the structure in the unconscious, because the idea is that it goes from less refined up towards refined, so that the human psyche is this vessel, if you will, that's organizing and purifying and refining real primitive motives and desires, and overcoming them, right, through the various processes that we consider to be civilization, right? That we started out uncivilized, we've been civilizing ourselves over time, but that we all still have in us, in the same way that in an individual lifespan, we still have an infant inside us, we still have infantile sort of energies and motivations, we still have the toddler in us, we still have the pre-adolescent, and that we're constantly dealing with the fears, the desires, the motivations at those levels. And the idea of regression, which is that any given moment we can all sort of take the elevator down and see and behave and feel from levels that are less mature, less awake, less civilized. And so that general idea of the psyche was huge, right? That unconscious forces were there, that there's a structure to these, right? That in general, it's what they what's considered the paranoid schizoid level of the psyche, right? That when we regress at a certain point we're going to hit paranoid schizoid, and that also there's a time and place for that stuff, right? One way I talk about it, if you hear a strange noise in the night in your living room, and you think someone might be out there, you're supposed to have schizoid content flood your mind, all kinds of ideas of bad stuff that could happen, right? And that's supposed to motivate you. And that's really going on all the time. If I walk around this room, part of my mind's looking out for sharp corners and, you know, constant little ideas of what could be harmful. And if you're in a schizoid state, the idea is that's more sort of maximized on your mind screen, or flooding you, or being given more priority than perhaps what seems appropriate in a given situation. If you're going to go walk across that street, right, your brain should tell you, hey, this is potentially life-threatening. You better be looking for, are there cars or not, right? And the idea that there's these levels. So from schizoid up into paranoid, the idea would be, okay, you get all, to use that noise in the living room analogy, the idea would be you're laying in bed, you hear something, and you have all these schizoid messages, but you don't know what's really going on. So then you shift into a paranoid state, and you're supposed to stay in that paranoid state until you figure out what's going on, right? So paranoia gets kind of a bad name in general. It's only used as like pathology or something. But there's a time and place to be paranoid, right? And you probably shouldn't just shift back out of paranoid because you don't want to be paranoid. Ideally, you go find out what's going on. And so if you go out in the living room and you realize, oh, it's not something that's threatening, right? The shutters making noise or something, then you're supposed to just, shift out of it, let it go, and decide that everything's okay.
Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out there.
That's right. That's right. If there is someone in the living room, then you're supposed to go into fight or flight, right? If there is a threat. If you're walking across the street and there is a car coming, you're supposed to go into fight or flight, right? And get out of the street. So just the idea that these are layers of the psyche, that we all have all these layers, and a lot of mental health is which layer are we coming from at any given moment, right? Because we have these patterns that perhaps put us in a paranoid state or in a schizoid state or in a fight or flight at times when the general idea is that's not really needed at that time. And so a lot of people find themselves sort of trying to fix their schizoid self, or fix their paranoid self, or fix their psychopathic self, which is different than, which is a whole different model than shifting out of that part of your psyche, right? So that, and again, back to Freud, in his models, which is in that little handout, that was certainly part of his thought, was that there are areas of the psyche, that it's not all just this little machine that's sort of like an AI machine today spitting out this stuff, right? It's more of a mechanism that is more thermodynamic, more energetic. There's more about flows and movements of forces rather than all just intellectual information. Okay. So the idea of structure, not just the structure of the unconscious, but the idea that we start building structures in our mind, which in the psychoanalytic school was like little programs, if you will, but not just informational programs. They ways that the nervous system develops the ability to tolerate flows of energy, right? So initially, there's all this just kind of unbridled energetic force that goes on in the human. And then there's this structuring that happens where the human, it gets tamed, gets organized, learns to harness their energies. And that these structures, to a large extent, are built before we become self-aware. So the idea is that the human starts to get into that pre-adolescent age range where they start to become aware of themselves. And the idea is that a lot of the programming, if you will, is already in there. They're operating via structures that have been built. And the general idea was that they are built relationally, right? That it's relationship that builds the structure much more than thoughts, right? So whatever the parents are saying, that's not as important as what are the parents doing relationally, physically, emotionally, energetically. The idea was that that's primary, which again, we've seemed to have gotten away from that even in parenting, where there's less awareness and emphasis on the need for kids at a certain age to let certain energies move, and that there's age appropriateness for that, and that to come in too early with rules and concepts for a child that's not really ready for that, you can skip developmental levels, you can cause developmental arrest or things like that, because there wasn't time for the lower levels to develop. Okay. So the mind-body relationship is another thing that isn't looked at as much today. We talk about mind-body stuff, but this model of the body needing to be developed, the body needing to be tamed, is kind of not thought of. We look at symptoms, psychosomatic stuff, nervous system stuff, but development in general seems to kind of have been moved out of the picture. We don't talk as much about the developmental model in psychology. I think some of that's from it gets dicey, obviously, when we talk about development. Physical development's one thing, but when you start talking about emotional development, sexual development, spiritual development, of course, you get right into different belief systems. And so to come forward with some sort of, set idea of a developmental scale, it's kind of too risky. And so it's just kind of been moved out of the industry, it seems. And I think that's unfortunate. The idea of levels of consciousness is another one. That was accepted at a certain point, that there were literal levels of consciousness, and we all again tend to agree that in an individual life there's age appropriate stuff, and so you can say, well, the 4-year-old's not at the level of consciousness that the 14-year-old is, and the 14 isn't that the 40-year-old is, but when you're talking about, for example, let's just say you're working with adults that are in their 30s, talking about those adults being at different levels of consciousness, again, gets super dicey, even though I think there's reality to it. And so just another thing that seems like the industry is kind of moving away from. The idea of psychic conflict is another one. In the psychoanalytic school, the idea was the ego is in conflict with body. That what we feel as motivation, feel as desire, feel as fear, etc. A lot of it is not appropriate to the culture we live in. And so Freud's idea of psychic conflict was that the human is not just naturally civilized, and not just naturally civilized to a particular culture. That what we call culture and civilization is this set of rules, and the human then has to try to fit into that culture. And much of what we feel and are motivated to do is not culturally appropriate. Even the most adjusted of us are constantly dealing with, what's going on. From the biological level, when you need to go to the bathroom, it doesn't mean you can go to the bathroom. It means you got to hold it, and you got to figure out when and where you're able to go. And it's just on and on from there, right? All these thoughts, feelings, motivations, there's constant need to, as Freud put it, delay pleasure and try to remain civilized. One of the big ideas, again, early on in psychology, was that it's very advantageous, even healing, even growth promoting, to set up a situation where you allow unconscious motivation to surface in your awareness, right? That was kind of the big idea of Freud's, was this talking cure was such that if you set up an environment where there's trust and intimacy, And then the technique he used was free association. If the client free associates in a context where they feel held and safe, what's going to happen is unconscious stuff is going to start to surface up into awareness. And that unconscious stuff is probably going to be pretty wacky, is the idea. It's not going to take long before it's going to be taboo. It's going to be dark. It's going to be irrational. And the idea was just let it come anyway. Don't censor yourself so much that you don't let yourself feel that. Similar with art, the idea is, just paint, just dance, just write what comes and sort of analyze it later versus too much curating. It doesn't even come out, right? And so again, it wasn't always thought that to have this irrational, taboo, dark, immature, whatever stuff come up, it was thought that, well, I'm a bad person, or I'm going to get in trouble if I even have these thoughts or have these feelings. So it was a real revolution, right, in culture to shift and start allowing this stuff. Okay, and then just finally on the psychoanalytic school, the idea of transference, projective identification, things like this, right? That relationally, we as humans have an intrapsychic experience happening. Content comes up into our mind, and then we attribute it to various things. And we don't necessarily attribute it accurately, right? So if I have a certain feeling or a certain thought, I may decide that that was Brad, or he caused it, or you're doing it to me, and it's surprising how much we do that, right? How much we all are inaccurately differentiating between intrapsychic experience, what we're thinking is intrapsychic from someone else, right? And then what's really going on in the relational field. And so the school of relational psychology eventually moved to where, in general, they say it's really always a relational field there, and there's hardly any focus on intrapsychic. So you've had kind of this full developmental arc that has happened. And then just one more concept in the psychoanalytic school, the idea that to get change, especially structural change in a human psyche, meaning when there was a structure built that is a pathological structure or an ineffectual structure or something because of a person's background, if you're going to get change in that structure, what you're going to see happen is a destabilization of that person's psyche, because the nature of it is we stabilize ourselves via these structures. And so to change a structure is kind of like remodeling your boat while it's at sea, right? It's a dicey undertaking, because things can get worse before they get better, or they can get really bad if you do too much destabilizing too fast. And of course, that's not an exact science. We're all kind of watching our clients as far as are they getting more stabilized or less stabilized session to session, right? And how much is the treatment a cause of that, right? And so in any given session, therapists are always trying to, whether they know it or not, I think, are trying to figure out, is what's going on right now something that needs some coherence and some support and some slowing down and some reorganizing and kind of getting bearings again, or is it the opposite? Is there a rigidity that's needing to come undone? Okay, so those tenets of the psychoanalytic school, I think there's a lot of validity to those, and again, I feel like they just aren't talked about, they aren't studied, and they aren't a part of the thought process in the schools today and in clinical practice in general. And I got real involved in studying that, and at the same time that I got real involved in studying energetics. So back to my process, you probably heard me say this before, but I went to Rolfing School out of college. I was just trying to get my hip fixed so that I could run again, and I wasn't looking at a career in any of this stuff. And then I moved to Minnesota, started a rolfing practice, and I started dating a woman who I eventually married, who was an energy healer. I thought that was all just complete nonsense. But over time, she converted me. I saw her work on clients, and and she worked on me, and I was amazed at what was going on. And so I set about studying it to understand the science of it, and quickly realized that studying the science of it wasn't really going to get me anywhere. It was more of an intuitive, experiential experience, and then over time, it just became more and more, a part of my world, a part of my lingo, a part of my reality. And so I've done a lot of looking at the energetics of transference, the energetics of projective identification, the energetics of repression, the energetics of possession, identification, and have been surprised that there isn't more kind of crossover with that. Obviously, there are things out there, but it's still not really a kind of accepted aspect of our in our culture. So that takes me to the dimension approach. And what I did, what the dimension approach is, again, is just a set of some certain concepts and paradigms that one can start paying attention to in any given interaction. So the first part of it is just that the idea that there's a conscious mind and then there's a ego mind, and that the conscious mind is not cognitive, it's not mentalizing, it's not the little me as is often talked about. It's the big me, it's S with self with capital S idea. Observing ego is a term that gets used. A mindful state, an open state, more of a non-dual awareness. The idea of unconditional positive regard, allowing. Those are all words that are sort of describing a certain kind of state that one can be in at any given moment. So that's the initial idea, right? Is to go into that kind of state, which again, I'm not inventing anything here. I'm just sort of pointing to some things. And that's a general kind of agreed upon thing. And in a lot of studies they've done, they've said that is really the most effective technique that therapists have, that produces more positive results than any interpretation, than any other technique or method. It's to sit and receive someone in an open state. It has a magic to it. So, and then what I noticed is there's these certain phases that ideally occur in any particular thing that someone's dealing with. So, a particular thing someone's dealing with, meaning a certain domain of experience, right? We have all these different experiences we have, and the idea is that the human being's psyche is multi-level, multi-dimensional, right? We're capable of all kinds of different ways of experiencing. And so just the general idea is that I use is that those are dimensions, right? So we're all sitting here experiencing various dimensions right now, right? And that it'll shift, right? And you have a bunch of dimensions that you're consciously paying attention to right now that might be different ones than you're consciously paying attention to. And so a lot of human interaction, people think they're both talking about the same dimension, and they're really looking at two different dimensions. And so for obvious reasons, that can be confusing, that can be frustrating. Certainly it can be unhelpful. And so figuring out what dimension of experience are we talking about, not just in a mental way, but in an experiential way. I think we all know when we arrive at that kind of engagement and contact, right? And we all tend to feel it when we're not. But there's just what I'm getting at is that there's a tendency to just go more and more mental when that happens, versus to kind of come back into the moment and allow yourself to attune to the other person. And there's a vulnerability in that, right? That can feel dangerous. It can feel dicey, especially if it seems like there's disagreement or miscommunication happening. There's a tendency to close off, right? So the 5 stages that I talk about are witnessing, holding, containing, mirroring, and contact. And just to go through them real quick, the idea is that initially we can show up as our conscious self and witness something, right? Which is different than just observing or thinking about, right? On my website, I kind of go into more detail about some of these things, but again, just to go through them quick, to witness is more to be conscious of, but to not be conscious with, is to be conscious of. But when you're witnessing, you're recognizing, you're honoring, right? And that's powerful in itself. But if you witness for very long, what's going to tend to happen is you're going to start to feel it. You're going to feel that which you're witnessing, and so empathy is going to start to occur. And then what happens is we either stay with that or we come back out of that because it was overwhelming, because we didn't like the feeling, because it seemed inappropriate, et cetera, et cetera. So we're all being conscious with or not, moment to moment, with each particular dimension of experience. So again, you'd be sitting there with a client and you can be listening very intently, wanting to help, but simultaneously sort of stiff-arming the actual dimension of experience that they are needing space held for and empathy with. And of course, typically what they're needing help with is often not super fun, light, cheery stuff. It's usually scary, dark, confusing stuff that hasn't been held space for them. So they don't know how to hold space for it within themselves. And so that's the way I think about it, that I'm there to try to be with, attune to the dimension, witness it, allow empathic holding to start to happen, and then notice, okay, is it happening? And I start noticing my limits. I start noticing my tendency to try to back out of that, or let's change the subject, or let's just go real mental as opposed to try to stay with it. So witnessing, holding, containing. The containing part is when at a certain point, the energy, the experience starts to feel like it needs to be bounded. It needs to be put in perspective. Maybe there's limits that need to get set. And so we can contain it. That doesn't mean we cease to hold. It doesn't mean we cease to allow space for, but just like in dealing with a little kid, at certain ages, you start putting certain bounds on them. The toddler that's running around, obviously you have to physically contain a toddler, right? Constantly, because they're just constantly going to get themselves in trouble unless you provide physical containment. And you start providing emotional containment, right? And that is not just a physical thing, it's not just a mental thing, but there's energetic, emotional, relational stuff going on in containing, just like there is in receiving. And that containing can seem harsh and cruel. It can seem unfair. But the general idea is that without appropriate containment, we feel out of control, right? And so the process of being contained, while initially often we don't like it, it provides a framework. It provides a container that we learn to tame and control and organize ourselves in. And then finally, or not finally, after containment, mirroring. What I've noticed is that at a certain point in the development of a certain dimension of experience, meaning going from unconsciousness to aware of it but disorganized, to it starts to organize. Mirroring is I start to provide a reflective gaze to the person's mind in a way that they start to become more aware of what it is they're doing, right? And so we all do this or don't do this moment to moment. We can just be looking at experience, or we can be seeing the person being with their experience and reflecting that experience to the person. And just like with containment, initially there can be resistance to that, because initially the way it works is we're more identified with the experience and we want the experience to have its validity, right? And the truth is, you aren't the experience. The truth is, your experience isn't an absolute reality. It's relative, right? And to have someone reflect back to us, it puts a limit on it. It makes it our responsibility, right? And so, for obvious reasons, there can be resistance to that. That I'm angry because I'm angry, and my anger is valid, and my anger should, you know, should take over the situation and be more important than everything else. And to have someone reflect back to me and make me very conscious that my anger is my anger, whether the situation seems to call for anger or not. The truth is my anger is my anger, and I need to be able to contain it appropriately, right? So with mirroring, just to be a little more clear about that, because the word gets used in different ways. I don't mean mirroring as in mimicking. I mean reflecting and reflecting what the person's putting out, right? Just like if Brad and I shook hands, there's a lot of different things that can be paid attention to. You can pay attention to what does your hand feel like. You can try to get a sense of what does Lance's hand feel like, right? You can get a sense of what are the two hands doing together. If I'm trying to mirror you and as we're shaking hands, the idea would be for you to become more aware of your sensory pathway in your hand and arm, more so than what's going on with me, right? So we learn via these feedback loops, right? We do a motor, like in the nervous system, we have the motor innervation, and then we have a sensory feedback loop that tells us what we did. So not just what happened, but what did we do, right? In sports, it's obvious, you hit a golf ball, you see where the golf ball went, and then you go, okay, what did I do, right? You sing a note, you hear the note, and then you're going, okay, what did I do to make it sound like that, right? Which is different than did everyone like my singing, right? So that's two very different domains of experience as far as what am I doing at any given moment. And for me to learn what am I doing, I need those feedback loops, right? Just like an infant starts out, the infant doesn't even know their own physical body, right? The Cheerio and their finger are just both food, right? And they come to learn that, oh, this is my hand, this isn't food. And physically, we get pretty good at recognizing what's my body and what's not my body. Emotionally, sexually, mentally, not so much is the idea. We're all still kind of walking around only partially individuated, only partially consciously awake of what's going on in me, what is self versus what is other, and conscious of the interaction that takes place. And so again, this idea of the dimension approach is noticing these different phases and noticing, can a person handle mirroring right now, or do I need to kind of not do that? And again, we all do this intuitively to various degrees, right? We all witness, hold, contain, and reflect, or we don't moment to moment. And then it's, well, why? Is that because of our own stuff? Is that because we're sensing that the client, is ready for this, but not for that, et cetera? And so I'm just putting some words to this and to the process. The last one is contact. And the idea with contact is that I'm going to bring myself now into engagement with the client. Prior to that, it was all about the client, right? It was relational. I'm here, but it wasn't about me bringing myself into their thing. It was about them, right? And once this dicey dimension that we're dealing with gets to a point where they can handle reflection and they can start to own it, at that point, then they can start to want to share it in a two-person way, where prior to that, it was more of kind of a one-person process. And so I know when we've arrived at conscious contact within a given dimension, and we can handle that contact together, and then what happens is you become aware that it's obviously a universal dimension, right? That whatever dimension they've got going on, I have that dimension in my psyche, right? Because the idea is we all have all the dimensions. And at that point, what I've noticed is we've really turned a corner as far as the clients struggle with that particular dimension. So it's intuitive, it's a felt sense, but more and more one, just like emotion, just like people who feel subtle energies or see subtle energies, you get more and more attuned, you notice more and more the dynamics, and you can notice more and more what mode am I in right now is the word I use. So I'll track that and I'll notice, okay, am I being consciously present? And okay, am I attuning to what seems like the right dimension here? Sometimes I'm sitting there going, no, I don't know. I'm not sure what we're doing. But then I try to stay open instead of just picking one, right? I try to stay just the open. But what'll tend to happen is the dimension kind of shows up when you just allow for it. And then it usually doesn't take long before I start noticing the reason the client doesn't want to deal with that dimension, because I don't want to either, often. But then it's like, all right, let's stay with it. Let's just hold space and let it move and see what happens. And then, okay, you know, are they just needing me to provide some supportive holding? Is there some containment that's needed? Is there reflection that's needed? And so they may be at any particular stage coming in with whatever dimension. And the idea is that we're all at some stage of how conscious of that dimension in ourself are we, right? Versus, are we in denial about it? Are we flailing in it and overwhelmed by it? Are we identified with it? Do we just kind of express that dimension unconsciously and force others to hold it? And the idea is we're all doing some of that in this dimension or that. And so, again, all the concepts I just said are concepts that are out there. Holding, obviously, Winnicott talks about that, and Rogers with unconditional positive regard. So they're all out there. I just am sort of listing them in more of a kind of a coherent system. And then just lastly, again, the idea is that those modes of conscious attending are not instead of some other technique. The idea is that those are inherently either there or not there in all the techniques, right? So you can be doing interpretation, you can be doing body work, you can be doing more of a nervous system approach, but simultaneously what's going on with regard to witnessing, holding, containing, mirroring, and contact. So I call that the dimension approach. And doesn't matter what you call it. It's not mine. It's not new concepts, but it's a certain way I have it organized in my head and utilize in practice. And I teach that to my students and I teach it to clients typically. If we go for very long, it starts to shift into actually talking about the actual thing that we're doing, and that often is helpful. All right.
Cool. Where do you teach?
Where?
Yeah.
Over at the Dimension Center, which is in South Minneapolis.
Okay. One point that you made that I thought was really cool, and I never thought about this, because nowadays bottom up is really important. It's top down. Is that all of the big three, Freud, Jung, and Adler, basically started this whole mess.
Yeah.
Were all physicians. So it is an interesting thought that this actually did start as a bottom up movement.
Right.
And then it kind of drifted away. I would argue, and this is going to be stated as a statement. Maybe you can take it as a question and then run with it, But it seems to me that the industry has kind of tried very hard to be a science when in fact it's kind of an art.
Right.
And it's a ton of pressure into how evidence-based and all this kind of business, which is, there's good aspects to that. And then there's kind of like an arc, and then all of a sudden it comes like, well, wait a minute. We understand now that bottom up is extremely important, and it's kind of taken on a different approach, but once again, it's from physicians.
Yeah.
Van der Kolk and Levine, I think are both physicians. Hauge, is Hauge a physician?
I'm not.
Okay. Well, that's a MD, yeah.
Yeah, that's what.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's coming once again from the bottom up, but this time it has kind of and this is what I want you to comment on, because of your Rolfing experience and all that kind of stuff. This time it's different. It is bottom up, but it's less of a kind of a psychoanalytic kind of forest or jungle or whatever.
Yeah,
And it's more of, no, it's just the body.
right.
You know what I mean? So take that and run with it. What am I trying to say? What do you think about it?
I mean, I definitely agree. Uh, and I think you said it well. I mean, there's an attempt to just have it be, well, that's just body, or that's just neurology. Um, that's just chemistry. And there's that can be true, but is the chemistry, is the neurology symptom, or is it cause, right? Because the general idea, even in physics these days, because it's interesting that Freud modeled the human psyche after discoveries that were being made in physics at the time, right? And so the second law of thermodynamics, everything moving towards entropy, was the foundation of his idea of the death instinct, and that's the primary movement in the human, and the idea that energies and thermodynamics are at work in the human psyche, and that just like with a machine, for example, you have to manage heat in a machine, right? And for a long time in the industrial age, um, machines overheating was like a huge common problem because they hadn't invented the switch yet. And so they didn't have regulators going on to manage heat in systems. Um, and Freud's idea was humans have these energies, heat, um, forces, and we're constantly trying to manage them. So his economic model um, focused on that. And uh, today, with the quantum revolution in physics, and the understanding now that at the subatomic level, classical physics doesn't apply, right? The laws are different. And there's the idea that in the human psyche, when you go deep enough, right, it's analogous to going to the quantum level, different laws apply. And that actually at each level, there's a different set of laws, a different set of movements and organizations. Um, and there's the idea that that fields are primary, not objects, right? So with quantum fields, the idea is that it's a probability field, and that's where it really starts out, and that's more what's real, as Jung talked about. And then we collapse into form, various thoughts, feelings, objects, and the reason I'm saying that is so the body mind idea, and the unconscious to conscious idea is that it's really what's primary is these fields, and they're relational fields being acted upon by various forces, and that the chemistry of it, the neural firing of it, or whatever, is downstream from those. Just an analogy that I'll tend to use: if you look at a tree and see the leaves moving, um, at a certain level of consciousness, you say, "Oh, that tree is waving its leaves around." As you get more scientific about it, right? You might say, "No, the tree isn't deciding that. It's actually air molecules that are rushing, around and moving the leaves." And then some people might say, that person thinks there's these little molecules running all over in the air, right? But then we found out, well, there are these molecules in the air, even though the human eye isn't seeing them. And then one could say, well, what's making the air molecules decide to run over here, run over there? And the idea is, well, if you go up another level, you say that the air molecules aren't actually deciding; it's pressure changes in the atmosphere that are moving the air molecules. And so the agency now is given to the pressure changes in the atmosphere. Okay, but why does the Earth decide to change its pressure this way or that? And eventually you get to, well, it's activity on the sun is really the primary motivator. And so again, just this idea of in the human psyche, where does it start, and what's really most powerful, and what's downstream from that. And the idea is you can have problems, for example, originating at any given point. So it's not like you got to go back to center or back to the sun with every single thing there is, but it's important to kind of look at, okay, just because you do a blood test and see that there's the chemical the chemistry is this way or that, or you do some kind of neurology thing and you see that there's firing this way or that. Again, there's the idea of, okay, is that downstream from something that's going on more emotionally, more energetically, more developmentally, more unconsciously in that human. And that part, it seems like in alignment with what you're saying, that's not really the unknown, the mystery, the jungle of the unconscious is just kind of, like you said, being cut out of it, and they're just starting at chemistry and starting at nervous system, which I think's a mistake.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
So, because like when you're talking about the body and the mind, like I kind of look at it like in a somatic and attachment approach, and also like I look at like what happened before consciousness, and then also what happened in the mother's womb, and then what happened to the mother, and what happened to the father, and then what happened to the generations before. And so like these things like get, unfortunately or fortunately, passed on, and so like sometimes we don't know.
Right.
why. And so like my approach is like, we don't know why, but we do know some history, we do know some things, and that can make a really big difference to some people as far as understanding, like, where does this come from within me? And why do I think this way? Or why do I have this tendency to keep repeating pattern?
Right.
And my response sometimes will be that, well, you know what? We get an opportunity to do it over and over again until you don't want to do it anymore.
Right. Yeah.
It's kind of like, oh, here it is again.
Right. Yeah, and on that note, and part of what I try to teach is that idea that becoming conscious of it, right? Seeing it versus not seeing it with your conscious awareness is the magic elixir, if you will. That this idea, and this is a fundamental tenet that some people disagree with, but the idea that our conscious self knows, our conscious self is healing, is the truth, right? This idea that there's truth, which is another thing that we've kind of done away with, that we live in kind of a world of absolute subjectivity these days, right? Versus, is there some sort of truth out there, and or different idea, but similar, is there a truth in there, right? Is there a truth in a human being? And does their health and well-being rely on them living and being in touch with their truth, right? Versus here are society's truths, getting proper alignment to that. And as far as, well, what is truth? I'm certainly not going to decide what someone's truth is, but what I'm trying to do is help their conscious awareness become aware of what are they doing, what are they feeling, what's bubbling up in them, and that it's the consciousness that is the healer, it's the consciousness that is the organizer, the awakener, etc. And so
with consciousness comes choice, huh?
right.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah, that prior to that, there's not choice.
You're just acting things out.
Exactly.
Or like missing puzzle pieces, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think about kind of the somatic part of the body, and like misunderstanding or understanding or just totally ignoring it. So
Right.
Some people, you use the term elevator. I sometimes will say, like, just take an elevator from your brain into your body and just kind of like you go through sensations, imagery, meaning making, affect,
Yeah.
right? And those kinds of things that can like, because it's a very hard thing, I think, for many people to go in. There is something that is a felt sense of danger or something.
For sure. Yeah.
And to like know that like my body feels it's dangerous, but my brain knows that it's not.
Yeah. Yeah. And the only thing I'd kind of add to that is we all have our threshold. Like you can only go so deep, and then
That's right.
it gets scary.
Yeah, and there's never a push for it, right? It's
Right.
like, do you think you can go only this deep, right?
Right.
You feel my throat, there's constriction. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Elevator just go to the sub basement.
Yeah.
I have a question. I'm not sure exactly how to articulate it, but so kind of depends on what the holding the container of your talk was. You gave us an overview of the dimension model, which is been really helpful. And yet you started off with the different axioms.
Yeah,
So how does that tie into your work?
yeah, thanks, good question. The way I use it is having an understanding of those psychoanalytic axioms. It gives me information as far as trying to navigate what's the process here, what kind of developmental process is going on. What are the energies doing? I'm using, for example, some of Freud's models, and looking at flows, looking at the economy of it, looking at the routing of it, and looking at, well, what's their ego mind doing in relationship to this dimension, right? And seeing, including both of those, right? Seeing that, okay, the person has psychic conflict going on with this particular dimension of their experience, and a lot of that psychoanalytic language. Are they identified with it? Are they projecting it? Are they fearing it? Are they possessed by it? And the answer to any of those questions is I'm going to consciously witness, hold, contain. But it gives me a map that's really helpful as far as just kind of understanding what is going on here. Where are we going? What might the process look like, as it moves forward? The psychoanalytic school and and those basic tenets are I feel like if those aren't included, it all just becomes mentalized, and there's not, the context gets lost. And so I'm using those really mostly for my navigating and having somewhat of an understanding of, okay, like I said, what's happening, where are we going, what might be the cause of the problem. And clients seem to find it real helpful. Most clients seem like they appreciate that kind of educating as to what's going on. And of course, I always say this is theory. This is idea. This is a view, right? But just that idea that I mean, literally, most clients I find come in and they don't even have that idea of perhaps there's unconscious stuff that's arising in me that I'd be better off to go ahead and feel it, express it, let someone else be in it with me, versus just how do I fix myself. I mean, there's just really those two views, and so I use the psychoanalytic language to express that whole model of the bottom up idea. Does that answer the question?
It does help, because I think it's really interesting as you talk about, clients come in with some view on their situation also, and pop psychology or the internet does whatever it does to influence people's views. But you hit on a point that really resonated for me, because I'm in a graduate program for MFT, and I don't know what it's like to go to Adler's school, but the story I tell myself is that it's more grounded in, okay, what's the Adlerian point of view? And I can tell you for sure that missing the framing of the different models in an MFT training program.
Right.
And kind of
You were mentioning that before you walked in the door.
Yeah. And so that's a little concerning. More than a little concerning for me. I mean, I was curious about when I was looking at schools, and what I learned, this is a little off topic, so forgive me, but what I learned is that all to align with coamphy, this is the curriculum, and there's very little variation between graduate schools.
Right.
I don't know where I'm going with that, except for maybe the question that might be more practical is, you've got a lot listed here. Are there other models which you also find useful in your practice?
For sure. And yeah, that's by no means an exhaustive list. I use a lot of with regard to levels of consciousness and awakening, let me back up. One way I talk about it is awakening, healing, development, and performance are different categories. And so with clients, I'll talk about that, or and usually we're doing all four because we're kind of always doing all four. But just to kind of start to narrow in on what's going on, some clients are coming to me because they have an awakening practice and that's their goal. Sometimes it's the healing of a wound or a trauma. Sometimes it's they're wanting to develop in a particular way. Sometimes they're just wanting to enhance performance. And there are models in each of those that I'll work with. And so in the awakening area, the Vedanta traditions and the tantric traditions are probably the two that I've kind of studied most and utilize most in my practice. In psychology, obviously, the psychoanalytic school, the relational school. With regard to healing, developmental trauma models, and models that involve mind states and altered states of consciousness. I use a lot with regard to healing stuff. The idea that to go more into, I would sum this up real quick. Like what Carl Jung figured out, he used the word activation, right? So we think of psychoactive substances, right? The substances that cause activation. And the idea is that whether you're on a psychoactive substance, a drug, or if you're dreaming at night, or if you're doing shamanic journeying or some kind of imaginal work, the idea is those are all going into the imaginal realm of the psyche. And the word active is used to talk about processing that's in the imaginal realm. And the general idea is we all are always having imaginal processing going on. It's just that might not be how it's organized on your mind screen at the moment. But if you take some acid, it's going to start to do on your mind screen, right? But what Jung figured out, and I've found it to be real true, is that when you, and Freud basically was talking about this with the idea of regression, that when you come out of that mentalized structured mode and drop more into the imaginal activated state, that's when there's real change available. And obviously one of the difficulties about that is we all like to go around feeling clear and certain and stable in our cognitive mind, except when we're partying and doing drugs and want to, but typically then it's a safe space and you do a certain amount of drug in order to.
You're kind of revealing yourself.
I enjoy I'm basically partying during every session because we're going into the.
Did you see the deadpan on my face?